Hello, my name is Thomas Maurer and welcome to the session Azure Governance and Management. I'm part of the Azure engineering team and I'm focusing on Azure management as well as hybrid deployments. And in this session, we're going to have a look how you actually can manage your Azure environment and govern your Azure environment and basically keep control of your environment without losing the advantages of the cloud like speed and agility. So when we talk about the cloud is all about acceleration, speed, and agility, right? We can deploy certain new services really fast. We can scale them really fast, up and down. We can really do a lot without ever having to wait actually for anything, right? And obviously, this is great. So moving fast and breaking things is fantastic. Until the thing you break is your neck. And we have seen that with many customers, right? They went out, doesn't matter which cloud provider you're looking at, and they start to deploy new services. And they realize, hey, that is great. I don't have to wait weeks for a new virtual machine for the approval process or someone creating the virtual machine for me. I can just go out and in a couple of minutes, I have my virtual machine. I can run my services in it and can try things out. And again, this is great, but there's also some disadvantage, right? I've seen that with many customers out there. They just go out, they give people access to the cloud, and they end up like in an uncontrolled environment where everyone just deploys things. Things get very unsecure because no one goes and checks the security baselines. And also cost spendings can get heavily out of control. So therefore, we need something called technical governance. And if you look at technical governance, we can basically identify like 5 pillars, if you will. Of course, we keep the deployment acceleration, we keep the identity baseline, but I want to highlight 3 of the other ones. So the first one I want to talk about is resource consistency. So when I have to do something and I need to do it like 3 or 5 times, I definitely get 3 or 5 different results if I do it manually, right? So I want to make sure that this can't happen and that we have a certain consistency in the things we're deploying, right? Talking about naming, but also about configuration of our Azure resources. And the other thing I want to talk about is cost management. So you probably have seen that we have these great virtual machines called the MV2 series, which are huge virtual machines with like up to 400 cores, I think up to 12 terabytes of memory, and they drain your credit card in 3 seconds. Now, you don't want everyone in your company with access to the cloud to just go out and deploy whatever they need and deploy the largest virtual machines out there, and you have that crazy amount of spending. You want to keep that control, and that's what we're going to have a look at. The other part is security, right? I already mentioned it before. Security and regulations are actually a big part of that. And so, for example, by default, Azure assigns a public IP address to a new virtual machine. And in many cases, that's what you want, right? If you build something which actually should be accessible from the internet, that's fine. But if you're an enterprise company, you probably don't want that for every single virtual machine. So you want to make sure that people just cannot go out and assign public IP addresses to virtual machines, so they're only accessible from your corporate network. As well as sometimes you have regulations where you can only deploy in certain Azure regions. And with governance, we can also keep that control so you can only deploy in certain regions. Now, what happens usually now is that we have this cloud custodian team, or the owner of the cloud, if you will, basically, being now again in front of the cloud and talking like if a developer or an IT professional or anyone wants to deploy a new service in Azure, they are basically need to run through them, right? And again, with that, we are losing basically the promises of the cloud, which is speed and agility, because now we again have that as like approval process in front of it. We need to wait on people to actually do something. And again, this is like what happens, and I've seen that many times. And with that, we're going back to that traditional approach. Now, what we actually want to do with our Azure management and governance tools is actually we give that cloud custodian team tools so they can keep the control of the cloud environment and make sure everything is configured as it should and people can only deploy what they need to, and then give access to developers or teams or operations people to actually go out and do things. But they obviously can only do the things they are allowed to do. So with that, with these cloud native tools, they can basically only have the benefit of the speed and acceleration, but you're still in control of the environment. So in this session, we're going to talk about Tammy Traders. And Tammy Traders is our new company which represents everyone and no one at the same time. And we're going to take it as an example what challenges that company has and where they need to go through and how that company is going to solve their challenges. Now, if you're looking about the Tammy Traders cloud governance challenges, they have a few we're going to have a look at in this session. So the first one is basically the lack of visibility in their environment. There are a lot of services deployed. They have a lot of different departments and teams where they go out and deploy stuff on Azure, and no one really has an overview. The other thing is what happened like previously, there were some people just accidentally deleting resources, and definitely Tammy Traders wants to prevent that in the future. They also have some PCI DSS compliance concerns. So they need to be PCI DSS compliant. And so we're going to have a look at that, how they can actually achieve that. And since they're like growing, they're large scale, becoming a larger scale deployment, they want to basically have that and scale that governance so they don't have actually go out and control everything manually. So they can actually go on and just onboard new subscription, which already have everything in place and everything is set up to be used. So let's start with the first challenge. And this is Tammy Traders has multiple teams in multiple locations working across multiple subscriptions. Sounds familiar? I bet it does. So no single person or team knows details of every workload that is deployed. The question now is, how does Tammy Traders get visibility into their complex cloud deployment? And for that, I want to introduce you to Azure Resource Graph. So here I'm in the Azure portal, and I'm going to show you a quick demo of Azure Resource Graph. To open up Azure Resource Graph, I basically go into the search and then can go and say Azure Resource Graph. And now what you can see here is I get basically the Azure Resource Graph Explorer. And you can see on the left side, I have what we call all the resource providers, which are basically there to help me creating queries. In the middle of the screen, you can see here, I can write a query with the keyword query language or KQL. Some of you maybe also remember the name Custo query language and things like that. So basically it allows me to write that query for my environment. And again, we use the same language for different things here. We use that also for Azure Log Analytics, or if you're familiar with Azure Sentinel, you can also use it there as well. Now you could go and basically build out your query using the left side where we have all the resource providers, right? Now, instead of writing now a new query, I just copy paste one I already have. And you can, if we have a look at this query, you can see here, I'm basically listing all my virtual machines here running in Azure. And then I basically summarize and count them by the different types of operating system disks. So I can see, hey, I now have 13 Linux VMs and 13 Windows VMs in my environment. Now, again, having this chart is great, right? And again, I really like you have that table, you quickly have that information, but sometimes you need something visual. You need to have a look at the visual environment and makes it easier to understand a little bit what's going on. Now you can build charts here. So for that, we just built a bar chart here. So I can see here again, I have the same amount of Linux and Windows VMs. I can see that I have 13 VMs each. I can now go and save that query. So I don't have to type it all the time. So I'm going to save it. And then I can also pin this to the dashboard. I want to quickly highlight this. So we get this now updated all the time. So when I remove a VM, that would show up in here as well. If I add more VMs from Linux or from Windows, I can see that here as well. And I can basically log into my Azure portal, open up my dashboard, and see it immediately here. Now, I really think that the Azure dashboard really is one of the most underestimated dashboards or Azure features, if you will. Because you can do so many great things. And let me show you a little bit of an advanced scenario here. So here I have a little bit of an advanced Azure inventory dashboard, right? We have a lot. We can also do like monitoring dashboards and a lot more. But here we have created one for inventory. So it gives me an overview about all the resources I've deployed here. So I can see here what are my top resources. I see my virtual machine data, my storage inventory, my network inventory. If I have SQL databases or app services deployed, I can see that here as well. So I can see that all in my environment. And if I want to edit something easily, again, behind it, we have that query. So I can edit that and basically change it to whatever I want to. So it makes it very, very easy to build those tools and quickly get an overview about what is going on in my Azure environment. Now, that was a quick demo about Azure Resource Graph. Azure Resource Graph can do, as I said, can do a lot of different things. Now, it really helps us to explore and get an overview about what is deployed in our Azure environment. And this is not just limited to like my subscription, right? This is about the whole tenant. So I can immediately find out what is deployed in my tenant, and I can basically go and see and take necessary steps. I can also do that like in the Azure portal, as I showed you, to get an overview about what's happening, right? However, I can also access that data like using the Azure API, using Azure PowerShell or the Azure CLI. So I can get basically that data out and basically put it in a other system if I want to. Now, another great thing about it is you have seen that queries I could do, right? And we're using the keyword query language to do this. So it makes it very, very simple to actually get that data. Now, if you have like a subscriptions where you, for example, run like 100 virtual machines or even more, and you did ever use PowerShell, for example, to do a get ACVM, you remember that this can run a while, right? Because it gets live data from all the different virtual machines and needs to get all that data. Now, think about it. If you do that now over multiple subscriptions with probably thousands of VMs, you would wait a couple of minutes to basically get all that information. And so what Azure Resource Graph does, it caches that information. So you can get a really, really fast response if you run one of these queries and you can see what's going on. And again, you get an insight. You can pin those to the dashboard. You can export that information and use it somewhere else and also build some automation around it if you need it. So let's have a look at the next challenge Tammy Traders is facing. A junior admin tasked with saving money deleted a VM that appeared to have minimal utilization in the last 2 weeks. Now, when we created that presentation, we highlight that we need to make sure that this was a junior admin, right? Because it doesn't happen to us seniors. It doesn't happen to us. No, but seriously, this can happen to everyone, right? And everyone has probably been there and removed and deleted something which they shouldn't. So what he did with that VM, because he saw that it was only used to perform a task at the end of the month, he thought, okay, that virtual machine is probably not really used. It was unutilized. However, the VM was actually used to do some important calculations at the end of the month. So as you know, best practice for a virtual machine like this would be probably that we shut down that virtual machine and then just start it up at the end of the year when we need it. Now, as you know, what the best practices are and what we do in reality sometimes has a long way to go. Now again, he just removed that VM and Tammy Traders needed to somehow find a backup for that VM and restore it if they had one. Now, How does Tammy Traders prevent accidental changes and allow ops to understand which resources should not be deleted? So this is a question we're going to address and have a look at right now. And this demo, I'm going to show you two very simple things, but they have a big impact, and it's called logs and tags. So here I'm back in the Azure portal. And you can see here I'm listing all my resource groups here. And if I want to delete one, I basically just go out, say delete resource group, and then type the name here of the resource group. This is basically the only blocker which allows me or gives me a warning that this is now gone. And if I delete that resource group, all the resources within that resource group are gone too. Now, again, this is not really a big check because the name of that resource group shows up like 3 times on that screen. So it's just to make sure that you think twice before deleting it. However, again, most of the time you just copy paste it, enter and delete all the resources in there. And again, this can be fine. This can be what you want to do, but in some cases, that's not what you want to do. Now, if we go forward, we just click on delete, and the resource group and all the resources in there are gone. Now let us protect a resource group. And for that, we go into one of these. And you can see here on the left side, I have logs. Now I can add a log here and give it a name, and I can give it a type. We have 2 types here, read only and delete. And I will talk a little bit about these in a bit. But again, I just create a new log. Let's say do not delete. And I can also give it some notes. And notes and descriptions, by the way, are great. Think about when you're not at work and someone else needs to pick up your work. They're going to be very happy if they have a little bit more information on this. So telling like, why would you not delete this? Why is this log there? Makes actually a lot of sense. So I'm going to create that log. And now I'm going back to that resource group. And if I now try to delete that resource group, you can see here, I again type the name of the resource group, and you can see here I have a lot of resources in there which would be deleted as well. Now let's go out and click on delete. And you now see that I get an error message telling me that that resource group is actually locked and therefore cannot be deleted, right? So I'm already protected that I cannot accidentally delete that resource group with all the resources in there. Now, still, I also want to give some visibility. And therefore we have something called tags. And tags are basically a name value pair where you can define a name for a tag and then give it a value. And in our cases now we make it a very visible tag. So we call it production and then say do not delete. Now we assign that tag, and you can see here now it shows up here on that resource group in the list of tags. If you have worked with tags before, again, this is a very visible tag. This is something, okay, we put in there to basically, like if someone logs into the Azure portal, that he directly sees that he should not delete that resource group. However, tags can also be used for other things as well, like in a more automated fashion, for example, for cost management. And I will talk a little bit about that in just a second. So now, if I go to all my resource groups, if I do a refresh, you can see here it also shows up here in my list of resource groups. So that was logs and tags, and I promised you to talk a little bit more about logs and tags. So first of all, again, if I use logs, all the resources inherit the same log. So if I assign it, for example, to a resource group, all the resources within that resource group get assigned to that log. They can have 2 types or 2 settings, if you will. One is the read only. That basically says, hey, you can't do any changes. You cannot delete it at all. And then you have the cannot delete, which basically means you just can't delete that resource group, but you can still go out and modify the resources or the resource group itself. Now again, this can be very handy if you, for example, deploy networking resources to a subscription and you want to give access to people to like deploy other stuff, but they should not really go out and delete or modify the networking part in that resource group. And then when we see about tagging, as I said, it's assigning metadata basically to Azure resources, right? I can just go out and assign these to Azure resources to basically organize my resources as well. And I showed you they can be very visible, but again, we can use it in many other ways. So for example, what we see a lot is if you use it for cost management, you can tag resources with a department tag. And then this will show up in cost management, and you can see how much cost do you have per department, for example. You can also use it in Azure Update Management. Azure Update Management allows you to manage updates for your virtual machines. And you can create something called dynamic groups. So think about it. You have two groups of virtual machines. One you want to upgrade on Tuesday, the other one on Thursday. Just so they're not updated at the same time. So if something is not good, you can stop it. So you can create a tag for each of these groups and then create a dynamic group basically based on these tags. Again, a tag usually has a tag or name and a value. And then it allows you to basically view those resources also by tags and values. So you can basically go and filter resources and organize your resources using tags. So the next question is now, we have that great tool for tags. How does Tammy Traders ensure that all the resources in that resource group have the same, the appropriate tags applied? So we're going to have a look at tagging using Azure Policy and using remediation tasks to do that. So here I'm back in the Azure portal. You can see here again my Azure resource group where I assigned the tag. And now what I want to do is basically I want to go out and use that tag on all my resources within that resource group because it does not get automatically inherited. So what I'm going to do, I basically go to policy, and then you can see here I can create new definitions, and then I can basically go out and look at the categories here for new policy definitions. I look at tags, and you can see here that I have now a couple of built-in Azure policies, and I'll speak a little bit about that in a bit, which I can actually use for my Azure environment. Now, let's have a look what we have here. So this one says inherit the tag from the resource group, and that sounds like the thing we want. So I click on this, and then you can see here now this policy definition. So you can see you get the name of it, you get a description, what it actually does, and then you can also see the definition itself, and this is in a JSON format. So this is a built-in one, so we give you exactly what it does. But you can imagine that you can also create your own policies depending on what you want to do. So if there's no built-in policy, you can basically create your own. So I'm going to assign that policy now. And the first thing I'm going to do is I select the scope. This is basically where do I want this policy to work. So I can do a management group. I can then all the way down to a subscription or even a resource group. And in my case, I'm just entering that in a resource group. Now I scroll down, I can then give a description for it. And then I basically define the tag which I want to inherit, right? So I give it like the FSS production tag. I want to inherit that for all the resources. I click on assign, and this now will take a moment to assign that. So if I go back to my resource groups, and I go back to my resource group, and if I have now a look at the compliance view, you can see here that now I have some non-compliant resources because they don't have that tag assigned. So basically the policy goes out and checks, hey, do my resources have that specific tag? And then it lists me all the resources which do not have that tag. Now to fix this, I can create a remediation task. So let me go out here, and you can see here a list of all the resources which are now impacted by that remediation task. So I click on remediate, and this will now take a while, but it will go out, and when it's done, we will see that now all of our resources basically have that tag assigned within that resource group. So again, Azure policies can help us with like tagging, but they can also do much more as well. They're an essential part of keeping your Azure environment under control. So Azure, what are Azure policies? Again, I used a couple of different names and initiatives and stuff like that, and I want to highlight a little bit what these are. So first of all, basically a policy is a rule that will be enforced, right? So that's basically a simple rule. And then we have initiatives. So initiatives are basically a collection of these rules, because oftentimes one rule is not enough. So you want to assign, like for different scenarios, that will assign multiple rules. And then you basically pack them together in a collection, in an initiative, and assign that initiative. And then we have the assignment. This is basically the scope where the policy gets assigned. So you can assign it to a management group, you can assign it to a subscription, you can assign it to a resource group, or directly to a resource. Now, Azure policies are really one of the hard pieces within Azure Governance and the Azure environment, and really help you to keep like the control in your Azure environment at scale, right? So there are certain built-in policies you can use. So we give you, as you can see, like the inherit tag one is a built-in one, but you can also create your own, right? And I'm going to show you a way where you also get even more custom policies from, which you can use. And there's also two types, really, what you can do with it. So you saw that we basically put it out there where we just first check the environment and audit the environment. So basically an audit mode, and tells us which resources are not compliant with the certain policies. Now, this is great, basically, and we also recommend that you start with auditing your environment, especially if you start with policy. But then you can also go out and say, hey, I want this so enforced, and I want to make sure that, like, I cannot even deploy resources which are not compliant, right? And this will basically go out and say, hey, you can, for example, this is very handy if you allow people only to deploy in certain Azure regions. You can block them from deploying resources in other regions, right? So again, there's multiple ways of handling this. If you're new to Azure policies and you start with that, we highly recommend that you start like just with auditing and basically going out and seeing, hey, what is not compliant environment, and then go out and fix it. But then at a certain point, you can really go out and block certain things. So again, Azure policies can do a lot. We can also then go out and remediate and automate that process to basically fix certain things. Policies are also there. You can see here we manage our Azure environment, but you can also use Azure policies, for example, for the Azure Kubernetes service, AKS, or to run like even within virtual machines or in the operating systems of certain systems. So we're going to have a look at that in a bit. So if you want to write your own policies, the first thing I would do is basically have a look at our GitHub repository here from Azure, because there are a lot of like already people written Azure policies, and they made them available in GitHub so others can use it. Now, if you don't find one, you can write it by yourself, and maybe you contribute back to that GitHub repository so people can actually also leverage your work as well, and you make the lives of others easier as well. Now, people are now coming to me and telling me, hey, we use Azure DevOps to basically deploy resources in Azure, right? We have that automated process. We use Azure Resource Manager template where we do infrastructure as code. And then the problem now, if we just use policies, we will go out and write that code, check in that code. We go to build and test, and then we go and deploy it. And then at one point at the end, we will see like if the policy is working or not. But we went through that whole process and it took a lot of time. Now, the great news is that Azure DevOps and Azure Policy integrate into each other. So I can basically give already the Azure Policy information within the Azure DevOps process, so that we get it before we actually go out and deploy things. We check against the Azure policies, so we don't even try to deploy something which will not work because of the policies, and you will know what is going on there as well. So let's jump into the next one. The next one is really about keeping compliance scenarios in place, right? And how does Tammy Traders assess PCI DSS compliance on their migrated resources. Now, Tammy Traders recently migrated some of their systems, some of their servers to Azure, and they're using, they want to find out if they're compliant, not just for their Azure environment, but also for the applications running in their virtual machines, for example. Now, let's have a look how we can actually do that and how we can audit PCI DSS compliance. Now here I'm back in the Azure portal, and you can see here I'm back with my resource groups. And now I'm having a look at one of my resource groups here, and again I'm going to policies. And then I'm going to have a look and assign a new initiative. Again, an initiative, basically collection of policies. You can see here it set automatically the scope because we're already in the resource group. And now we can go and select our initiative. You can see here, I can basically go and say, hey, just give me the built-in ones. And then if I scroll down here, you can see here we already have a couple of them. And we even have one for auditing PCI v3.2.1 2018, which basically goes out and audits my environment. But even more interesting, it also says controls and deploy specific VM extensions to support audit requirements. Now, when we talk about VM extensions, we allow basically Azure to extend like certain management capabilities to our VMs, and Azure policies can take advantage of that using Azure guest configuration policies. And we're going to have a look at that right now. So I'm going to assign that. So I give it a description again, and then assign that initiative here. And then this will again take a while now, and we'll go out and audit that environment. So if I go and do a refresh, you can see here it has not started yet. Well, then at one point it will start auditing. And if I go in there, you can see here after a while, and if I refresh, I can see here I check now the resources against these policies in that initiative. And what you can see here, some of these policies I'm not compliant. You can but also see that I have policies which I'm actually compliant, and that's fine. But now I want to have a look more or less at the policies which I'm not compliant at and see how we can actually go out and fix that. Now, if I look at one of these policies, I can see that I basically can go out and create a remediation task to actually go out and deploy the prerequisites to audit VMs that do not have a maximum password age of 70 days. So I can actually go and configure actually the VM settings within that. So I can see here again which VMs will to apply that setting, and then I create a remediation task, and then this will go out and basically configure that specific VM settings, and I can actually figure out what's going on, and am I PCI compliant with that. Not just about my Azure environment, but also like with my guest operating systems running in Azure VMs. Again, this works for Linux and Windows machines in both cases. So now we have seen how Tammy Traders can go out with that. As I mentioned before, Tammy Traders wants to scale that even further, right? So how does Tammy Traders ensure that new subscriptions and new resources deployed to those subscriptions align with PCI DSS? So in this demo, we're going to have a look at Azure Blueprints. I'm back in the Azure portal, and the easiest way to get to Blueprints is just basically search in the search bar for Blueprints. Going to Blueprints here. And then you can see here, we get the welcome screen. And what I'm going to do is I'm just creating a new blueprint here first. Now, the great thing is you can start with a blank blueprint, as you can see, but we also already give you a couple of templates, if you will. And you can see here we have them for ISO, we have them for PCI DSS, we have them for UK official, we have them for UK NHS. So we already give you a couple of those, and this makes it very easy to basically understand and get started with certain certifications and regulations to keep that in mind. However, we also give you some very basic ones. So blueprints are not just about deploying policies at scale, right? In some cases, if a new subscription is created, you also want to make sure that they, for example, already can connect to the network infrastructure so that the virtual network is already in place. So if they start creating VMs, they already have the virtual network. So we also gave you one, for example, how the basic networking of VNet, for example, is already in there. And so you can set up then VNet peering if you're in a hub and spoke model. So, but for us now, we want to make sure that we are PCI DSS compliant. So for that, we take that template and then we give that blueprint a name. So we call it Tammy Traders PCI. We're going to save it. And then on the next page, we see the artifacts. Now, this is actually what's in that template already, right? So I can see here that on a subscription level, it does certain policy assignments. So for example, it needs to have like threat detection on SQL servers. It only allows, like we need to limit it on which locations are allowed, and so on. And you can see here, I can also add more artifacts. If I have specific requirements, obviously, I can add more to that as well. Now for us, that's good so far. Again, as we said, we have a list here of those things, and then we save that as a draft. Now that blueprint now is in draft mode, so it's not really used. The first thing I'm going to do is now I'm going to publish that blueprint. I give it a version because obviously we can do versioning of these. And now I can go and basically see that blueprint now, and I can start using it. And now I can go and assign it. For example, in this case, I'm going to assign it to an existing subscription here. And then I can also configure certain locations. I can also configure the logs. So in my case, that are the same logs as before. So for the resources deployed with that blueprint, I want to use the do not delete log. And now here, very interestingly, you can basically go out and configure certain values of those artifacts, right? Because again, the PCI DSS does not really tell you which locations you need to deploy, right? But it tells you that you need to limit this. So the first thing what we're actually going to do is we can go out and select the Azure regions. And since Tammy Traders now just wants to deploy in US regions, in that case, I'm just going to select all the US ones. And then it also tells us, okay, we need to deploy a storage account where we can have audit logs basically for SQL servers. And so we need to deploy that storage account, and we'll do that. But we also need to have a resource group where that storage account is in. And so we can define the name of that storage account. So we're going to assign it, and this will now deploy all the specific artifacts to that subscriptions. This can be, again, policies, but it can also be Azure resources, and we're going to have a look at that in a bit. Now, if I go now to assign blueprints, I can see here that I have my blueprint assigned to the specific subscription, and I can also see the version for it as well. So again, I can have multiple versions. I can later go back and forth between different versions if I want to. So that was a demo of Blueprints. Let's have a quick look at Blueprints itself. It really helps us to streamline the environment creation process, right? So if it's basically a template, if I create new subscriptions, so I can give certain teams the capability to create new subscriptions. So they need some new development subscriptions, or they have new departments or new apps. They want to have a different subscription. They are automatically get assigned the policies and the resources, and they're already configured in the right way. And it makes it very easy for me to basically keep that compliancy over everything. Now, let's have a look how that actually works. So we have, let's say we want to build a blueprint. It's recommended like cloud engineers and architects, and maybe also something from security and networking, and all these people come together to see how does that actually need to look like. And then we built that blueprint definition. And the blueprint definition cannot just be policies, as I said. It can also include Azure Resource Manager templates. So you can already deploy certain resources in Azure you need, for example, networking. You can already configure role-based access controls. So you can already assign groups with the right permissions. And something which will come in the future is like custom scripts, which you can run again as well. And this gives you basically a secure foundation, and then if subscriptions are created, they're basically already assigned to that. And then we can then versionize this, as I already mentioned, so you have different versions, and we give you a lot of already built-in blueprints. And what I recommend people usually start with one of the built-in ones, even though you don't have that regulation. It gives you a great idea what you actually can do and what you should actually implement. Now, one other thing I want to mention, we're also using blueprints heavily within Microsoft for our own subscriptions to make sure that they are set up and configured in the right way. Okay, now so I was speaking a lot about like different things in Azure, like subscriptions and resource groups, and also a couple of times mentioned the word management groups. So I want to highlight that in a little bit, and we're going to have a look how does Tammy Traders organize and simplify the subscription management. And that's where management groups actually come in. So management groups really simplify our subscription management, and they basically allow us to build that hierarchy in a way we want to do it. And we can basically go out and then assign different Azure services or controls against these. So we can, for example, go out and assign Azure policies instead of a subscription on a much higher level, so it affects multiple subscriptions. And the same works with Azure Security Center, blueprints, cost management, or role-based access control as well. So again, Azure Management Groups, a great place to basically organize your subscriptions. And this is a quick example how that can look like. Obviously, it really depends on your organization, where you're working on and the environment you're building. In this case, we have a root management group, which is the top one. And everyone has this root management group. Even though you haven't worked with management groups before, there is one existing already, which is called the root management group. And then we created, in this example, you can see here we have two other ones, one called the prod and one the pre-prod. And they have multiple subscriptions in there, and we can now assign RBAC and policies to prod, as well as we can, for example, assign different ones to pre-prod if you wanted to, right? So we can basically manage that, and we can build multiple levels. It's not just limited to one level, and we can really go out and build that. So what I see a lot is that there are management groups, for example, for departments, which then can basically create their own subscriptions within that for dev, test, or whatever they are, however they are doing that. But they already have the policies in place. So I'm just basically controlling that department. Whatever they do, they always have these policies in place. So this is what we look at. So if we look at everything in here, we looked at management groups, how you can build that hierarchy to manage and organize your subscriptions. We looked at policy, how you can actually keep control of your environment. We looked at blueprints, how you can streamline the subscription creation process and make sure that they're already configured in the right way. And then we looked at resource graph at the very beginning, where we actually had a look at how can we actually get visibility across our Azure tenant and in all our subscriptions. And then we did not really talk about the cost management part, but there was another great session focusing on that as well. However, a lot of the tools like policies and tagging, they play a big role in cost management. Now again, with these tools and these basically cloud native governance tools, we give the cloud custodian team or the management team for the cloud the actual tools and control they need without really losing the agility for the developers and operations people who actually need to deploy stuff. Again, these are parts like blueprints, policies, and management groups. Now, one thing I want to share, this is a little bit of a high-level architecture design of our management tools, if you will. So when we start on the left side here, what we can see is actually if you're a customer, you basically use the portal, use PowerShell, the CLI, or other APIs to actually interact with Azure Resource Manager. And Azure Resource Manager is actually the whole control plane which actually does all the magic of the things I just showed you. Basically, it's all about RBAC, permissions, blueprints, policies, all of that is happening with Azure Resource Manager. And Today, or like I shouldn't say today, in the last year or in the beginning, this was only used for Azure resources, right? But however, it would be great to also use that for non-Azure resources. And this is where, for example, Azure Arc comes into play. What Azure Arc can do is basically onboard non-Azure resources to the Azure Resource Manager. And so we can extend the capabilities of Azure Resource Manager to manage, for example, as of today, servers, Kubernetes clusters, or data services outside of Microsoft Azure. So if you want to learn more, we have Microsoft Learn, which is a great free way of learning. So you can go out and we have a collection here of different learning modules and learning paths, which you can go through and learn more about Azure management and governance. And then I also want to give a shout out, like if you're looking at getting certified, you can look at that as well. So we have, for example, the Azure Fundamentals exam or the Azure Administrator exam, which are part of basically governance as well. So with that, I want to say thank you, and I hope you enjoyed that session about Azure governance and management.